Everyone who has already joined us. My name is Adam Sokol. I'm one half of the Professional Book Nerds podcast with Joe Grunenwald, who is on the screen as well, either next to, below, or above me. We host the Professional Book Nerds podcast. We do Mondays and Thursdays, so 2 episodes a week. Every Monday we do an author interview. Every Thursday we do book recommendations and all sorts of fun stuff. So you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Monday's episode will be this, so you can listen to it twice. Today, so we were joking a little bit before we came online for all of you to see us. Normally we have a yearly tradition where Marie Benedict, the wonderful, fabulous author of Carnegie's Maid and the other Einstein and all sorts of fun things, she always comes to Cleveland and does a part of her library tour in Cuyahoga County where our office is located. And for like 4 or 5 years now, I think 4 years.
4 years, yeah.
Yeah, so usually around this time of year, Marie comes and visits us in the office and we have fun and we do exactly what we're going to do today, which is talk about your latest book. But this time we can't be in person, but we do have lots of friends joining us. So there's that.
That's fun. Something new. But I miss you guys.
We miss you
We
too.
miss you too.
So sad to not be in person today, but I'm delighted to be here with you and part of our annual get together.
Our little annual get together, yeah. So Jill, do we want to start asking some of our questions or should we do the trailer first? What do you think we should do?
I mean, we should talk about why we're all here, which is Marie's new book. So tell us about your new book, Marie.
Well, you guys have been with me through so many women, so many historical women, and today it's about somebody we probably have all heard about. Usually my women are unknown historical women, and today it's probably somebody a lot of your listeners or readers have read. That's Agatha Christie. The book is called The Mystery of Mrs Christie, and it's the story of her disappearance in December of 1926, when she was a young author on the rise, right? She just published her 3rd book. She mysteriously disappeared. And for 11 days, no one could find her. The largest manhunt in England's history was launched to try and find her, and to no avail. And then on that 11th day, she just as mysteriously reappeared as she had disappeared. Sorry about that, guys. I have always been intrigued by Agatha. I've loved her since I was a kid. But I have to say, when I learned about her disappearance, I became even more intrigued about her. And I realized that even though I knew her as a writer, I didn't know her as a person. And once I dug a little deeper, I thought this story was really a pivotal one for us to understand how she became that, really legendary author that she is. That was a little long-winded, but anyway, that's generally what it's about.
I remember you told us about this maybe the last time you were in town. You were writing it, and both of us are huge Agatha Christie fans. We got very, very excited.
It's so excited. We were like, can we talk about that? And at the time you couldn't yet, I think. And
I was like, I think I was talking about Clementine Churchill back then. But yeah, I mean, like you guys, huge Agatha Christie fan, huge.
Before we get too far. Sorry, not to cut you off. Margaret from Sourcebooks wants to make sure we tell everyone why we're doing this today, because this is a very special anniversary, correct?
Right. This is the date of her disonce. I mean, obviously she didn't disappear today. She disappeared today in 1920. So it's not a typical anniversary that you celebrate, but we're certainly marking the occasion on this very special day. But I like to think of this day as the beginning of Agatha as we come to know her through her books. In many ways, it's the beginning, I think, kind of her rebirth as a person, as a woman, really shackled by a lot of constraints of her time period. And without giving away too much of the book, this is part of her way of breaking free. Is that too much of a spoiler? I don't know.
I don't think so.
I think so. In fact, I was laughing. I told you, I normally when we're with you, we don't prepare a super ton of questions because we all just get along really well. But I wrote a few out just to be careful, just because in my mind I was like, all right, I want to write some questions out that aren't too spoilery because it's like there's so much. You sort of peel back. I want to tell everyone, by the way, before I forget, Cindy's going to yell at me if I don't mention this. If you guys want to use the Q&A section, she just slacked it in real time. If you want to write in questions for Marie in the Q&A, we will get to some of those later. I wanted to mention that, but it is the book. Every chapter you read, it's like you kind of learn a little bit more of the story. And so I was like, okay, how does one ask questions about a book that's entirely a mystery,
Right. And I mean, it's, this book and writing it too, structuring it the way I did, it's a little bit different than some of my other books. All my books are, kind of that deep dive into a woman's really intimate emotional life and kind of exploring almost like her origin story, how she came to be this incredible historical figure who really left a huge legacy for us, right? But this book, because they called her the Queen of Crime, she's a queen of mystery. I felt like, how could I write a book about her and not have it be, like you said, a mystery unto itself? Because really at the core of her life, from the point, it's this pivotal point, but it's also the core mystery in her life. And so how could I have written it in any other way? Although that was so daunting, like how do you write a mystery about the Queen of Mystery and not feel like totally intimidated by that process? So I did my best, but you're right. As we're in some ways, one of the stories is very much like my books, right? One of the stories is kind of Agatha's origin story, who she was, who she became, the kind of pivotal moment in her life that I kind of feel like gives her wings in a way to become this formidable talent that we all know and love. But then spliced into that origin story is the mystery itself. And hopefully I do her justice. It's a hard topic to write about.
Yeah, no pressure there.
No pressure. I just love her so much too. And the more I came to know about her and who she was and who she became, the more I just fell in love with her as a person too.
Well, I do actually want to ask a little bit about your research process because, obviously when you write about these real women, research has to be involved, but there's a lot about her disappearance that even now in 2020, we don't really know. So how did you go about developing the story where there's like a big chunk of it is still kind of unknown?
That's such a good question. And I really feel like that unknown really had, in a way, I felt like it was an invitation to me personally to write a new story. It's like, how can we not know? We've got to fill it in. But just to back up a second, I mean, I think, with all of my women, I'm all about their original source material. So things that they've written about their lives, letters, journals, things, if I don't have that, then things that people who knew them contemporaneous with that time period wrote about them. And then if I don't have that, I kind of cast my net wide and really look much more broadly at the sort of micro, macro historical context. What's really interesting about this particular story is Agatha Christie wrote an autobiography, right? Which I totally invite anybody who's never read it to read it. It's rambling, it's not chronological, it's total stream of consciousness from this magnificent woman. I think she was in her 70s or 80s when she wrote it. I mean, she's really at the end of her life. And there's actually an audio recording that goes along with it. So for you guys, I mean, it's amazing to hear her voice, right? But the one thing she doesn't discuss, she discusses the clothes and food she wore as in her youth. She does not talk about her disappearance. And so it's kind of into this gaping black hole that I kind of put a lot of the story. And so, when I think about my research, I think about it kind of as the architecture of the story, and it's in those gaps that I kind of fill in. Well, all I had right here at the center of the story was the gap. And so to fill it in, I kind of used what I often use in those gaps, which is kind of a mix of the research and sort of that deep understanding I've come to have about the woman herself, through her letters, through her writing, through her interviews, and the things about people who knew her said. And I kind of sort of extrapolate from that to fill in that gap. And for me, with this particular story, I mean, the gap was so huge, right? I mean, we have 11 days that we don't know anything that happened and some time leading up to it too and after. But I felt like I had come to know this brilliant woman, this woman who wrote plots that people could not unpuzzle, right? Who created masks for characters that no one could see behind. How could she have been a victim in her own vanishing? How could she have just disappeared by someone else's hand other than her own? So kind of all those things that I came to know about her informed that big black hole that I kind of wrote into.
You talked a little bit about, like, what was available to you from a sense of she's the type of figure who that she was well known, and you said, like, written about during her life. So obviously those assets were available. I imagine, like, Hedy Lamarr was probably a little bit similar, that you could find things about her. But
totally.
Whether it's like letters or things for Agatha Christie, like, are there things when you have to go, like, discuss with the author's estate or, like, people who have a direct contact with that type of stuff, and then do they provide those for you?
So in this case, her family had actually put together a lot of really interesting things that were available. They're very private and they don't let a lot out, just in general, and that's fairly well known. But they have, especially her grandson, put together some really wonderful things about her life. So part of the book, one of the events that takes place, that's not a spoiler, is this magnificent round the world tour, really, that she and her husband, Archibald Christie, went on when their daughter, Rosalind, was very young, when she was 2. And it was to promote really this big expo that they were having in England. And they went around to all the countries affiliated with Great Britain. And one of her family members put together almost like, I don't want to say it's a scrapbook, it's much more elevated than that, but it's letter excerpts, photographs, all sorts of wonderful little pieces of information about that tour. And so from something like that, you can really fill in a lot of gaps. In her own, of course, we have her autobiography. There are some letters that are available. But I will say, after this event happened, it got tricky, because the person that she was before the event is a very different person than she became later in her life. So the person that pictures of, that was interviewed when she became famous, because remember, at the time of this book, she's not famous. I mean, she's on the rise. She's an established, starting to become known author. She had just published The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which is super important, I think.
It is, yeah.
It's, quintessential unrivaled narrator story. You got to tell me that's a coincidence, right? And then she disappeared. So, you have this the before and the after. That she becomes very reclusive. But before, she's a woman, who, one of the first Western European women who learns how to surf. I mean, she was this huge personality. And that too kind of informed the black hole. So, you have to work with the restraints on the original source material. Gather what you do have and what you can access. And there's an additional source in writing this book that's different than any other book I've written, and that is her books. Authors put a lot of themselves, I'll let you read the tea leaves on that one. They put a lot of themselves into their books, and Agatha is no exception. She is processing things that are going on in her own life in these books. Like a case in point, she wrote this wonderful book. You guys have probably never read it. It's really early. I don't even know if it qualifies as like a straight up mystery, but it's called The Man in the Brown Suit. And it's one of her first books. She wrote it when she was really young. I think it was serialized and then maybe put into a novel form. And you see in that book, in this sort of hopeful, innocent, romantic perspective, the person that she really was in those early years. And you can derive a lot of that. And then as she gets older, her books become more complicated. You start to see some of the themes that she's dealing with in her own life in those pages. So, gosh darn it, I had to do a lot of reading of Agatha Christie novels to actually put together her story. But yeah, I mean, it's really interesting the way, looking at her and looking at her through the lens of her own work as well.
Poor you, having to read all of her books for research.
It was such a hardship, and I almost gave it up, because I had to, read a whole bunch. Several I had never even heard of before. You think you've read them all, and then I came across this gem in a flea market sale recently. Not recently, 8 months ago. All these books that you think and then there's always another. And she did so many wonderful serialized novels and short stories, and of course, she had a whole series of books she wrote under a different name.
Yeah, there's the short story collections. Like I'll even find them. I'll pull up Libby and I'll be like, I've never heard of any of these. And it's like, I like that they always put like some Miss Marple, some Hercule Poirot, some just like random mysteries. And you're never really like, I very much enjoy it's almost like an Easter egg when they're just like telling a story and it's like a tertiary character is Hercule Poirot. And I'm like, oh, that's like, I know that guy.
There he is. Yeah.
So you talked about, and again, everything that that I wrote out is very early in your book, so it's not like a lot of spoilers, but you talked about her life and her books sort of being intertwined. So she had a job during the wartime that kind of, it seemed like it influenced her work. Would that be fair? See, I'm doing this like very vague so I can let you say as much as you want.
I like that. What kind of day? Oh yeah. I mean, she, what's interesting about, and again, this kind of goes to the woman that she was, she was very open to trying a lot of different roles in World War I. She grew up, just to backtrack a second, she grew up in a relatively aristocratic family. I mean, they weren't titled or anything, but they were part of sort of this moneyed, connected, upper class England. A class that kind of disappeared when you went from World War I to World War II and things really changed. But girls of her class they didn't want to be nurses, right? Because that was way too bloody for them. In World War I, she dabbled her hand at that, and she found that she had no problem with the blood. She was in fact fascinated by the amputations and the surgeries. And I think that played a lot into her later books. But I think you're talking about the role she took next, which was as I think we call it like a pharmacist assistant today. She had to receive special training for it. And back then it wasn't like, we go into a pharmacy today and the medicines are already pre-prepared, and really the pharmacist, I mean, they have an important job, but they're very often assembling things that are already pre-made. No, they were making everything by hand back then. And there were poisons, something that could be extremely helpful in a low dose, just the wrong dose, suddenly it becomes lethal. And she had to learn how to do all of that sort of medical preparation and do it in wartime, so there's a ton of pressure. And so she became really fascinated and knowledgeable about poisons. And it was actually during like some downtime as she's, filling these prescriptions or filling hospital prescriptions, that she kind of came up with the idea for her very first story. She realized that right there in front of her on all of those shelves were some poisons that, if used properly in the way she would know how, would be an undetectable murder weapon. And what's interesting about that, I think, too, is that the idea of this book had kind of been percolating in her head for a long time. She had an older sister that she was very close with, Madge, but they were very competitive, as sisters occasionally can be. And her sister kind of, when a couple of years prior to that, had laid down a gauntlet saying, I bet you can't write a book, a mystery novel that would be unsolvable. And so she had this kind of like jangling in the back of her head for a really long time. And as she was sitting, before all of those, I like to think of it as like multicolored vials, that she can like concoct, she realizes that she actually could create an unsolvable mystery. And that she could kind of rise up and claim that challenge that her sister told her she couldn't do. So, but she used that knowledge, repeatedly in her novels. And then of course she used it in the war effort in World War I and World War II. She worked in a pharmacy again to aid the war effort in World War II.
I was just laughing because you said if they were used properly, as opposed to...
Not the way you and I would think of as.
Yeah. But no, it really that did help me. I didn't know much about her personal life. I've just always been a fan of her books. So like And I always thought when I would be reading them or listening to them and be like, how is she just making like the poison stuff? It's too accurate to be faked. And so this makes so much more sense because, like, I don't know, I just feel like even researching it for your stories wouldn't give you the knowledge that she had working with it every day. It's very interesting.
It is. And I mean, she knew so intimately how to use those. I mean, because she was doling them out to people as part of her job, and that information never left her. I mean, in so many of her books, she uses poisons. It's not always the case, but frequently it's the case. And it is sort of that perfect, untraceable, unsolvable puzzle. And I love that it's that job. I like to think she would have embarked on her career regardless, but it's interesting to think that it was that challenge and that access and knowledge that really opened the door and had her walk down the path of becoming this astonishing mystery writer.
So can you just sort of curiosity, you've mentioned that at this time of her disappearance, no one really knew who she was. Like, she wasn't the Agatha Christie that we know. So, like, who was she? Like, what was her life like at that time?
Well, at the time she disappeared, she was married. She had served in World War I. Her husband in World War I he was a decorated pilot, and the idea of like an Air Force was very new, so that he was kind of celebrated for that. They got married during the war. And after the war, her husband had, she did what many women of that time did. She stayed at home. She ultimately had a child. Her husband was kind of struggling with finding the right role after the war. I think, looking back on it, he might have had some PTSD from the war. He wasn't the easiest person to be around, very mercurial, or to put it that way. And I think so she was more or less happily married. I don't think she really realized the depth of the discomfort that was happening there. But what stayed with her from that, sort of momentous occasion where she was in the pharmacy, was this desire and drive to write books, mysteries specifically. And right after the war, when her husband was looking for and trying to find work, she actually landed her very first contract with a company called Bodley Head. And that book was The Mysterious Affair at Styles. That was her very first book. And she didn't make a ton of money from it, but she was so, like, they needed money at that time, even though Agatha was kind of from a more upper class, sort of, not aristocratic specifically, but higher class background. Her father had a tremendous amount of money, most of which was lost. They lived in what we would almost think of as like a mansion or like a castle. They called it a cottage back then, in a beautiful town in Devon. People didn't work. They were sort of gentlemen and ladies. They needed the money. And so that her working as a writer was something that was very helpful to her husband and then her daughter. But it all had to be smoke and mirrors, it wasn't like she could be overtly be a writer, because ambition was a dirty word for a woman back then. And that's really one of the very, I think, timely themes in the book, is that struggling with that balance of family and, marital obligations with personal desires and personal ambition. So she had to run a perfect household, take care of her daughter, make sure dinner was on the table. She had help, of course, not as much as most women of her class, but she had help, and kind of write in those hours when no one was looking. And that's kind of what she was doing at this time. But her personality was very gregarious. She launched off on this round the world tour with her husband. She was really game for so many different activities. Her husband was more subdued than she was during this time. And so this is a kind of life that she's leading around the time of her disappearance, without giving away too much.
Also, without giving away too much, man, this is so hard with this book.
I know.
There is a letter to her husband that is slowly unfolded. I'm not going to say anything else.
Yes.
It's a pivotal plot point. Did that letter actually exist? Like, did that?
The letter itself existed, yes. So there was, okay. I think it's okay to say there was, at the time of her disappearance, there was a communication that she might have left behind for her husband. And without saying what was in it, there was indeed a letter left. Mm-hmm. However, due to circumstances that I probably shouldn't mention, that letter was never destroyed, was destroyed, and therefore no one really knows what was in that letter. So that's one of those sort of black hole areas that I felt able to insert fiction. You know, as with most of my books, you know, I'm trying to honor the woman I'm writing about. You know, I feel really responsible for these women. You know, Agatha Christie is known for her work, but she herself as a person isn't really well known. And other than sort of this iconic figure that we think of, her, you know, as a young woman, as a person who really struggled, as a person who had her own issues, you know, it's always my fictional version of who she was, and absolutely my fictional version of what happened during these days, because we really don't know. But the letter itself existed. And that was a big deal, you know, during the disappearance, that there had been a letter and then suddenly there wasn't.
Almost like that husband of hers isn't on the up and up.
It would make one think, wouldn't it? It would give some, you know, very ambitious detective pause, perhaps. I don't know.
I promise people who are new to our podcast, we usually ask more pointed questions than this, but we like...
It's hard, I know. You know what's interesting about this whole thing is that I feel like during her disappearance, her husband was his own worst enemy. I think that's fair to say without giving too much up. So many things that I wrote about actually happened. And as you're writing about it, you're thinking, why on earth would he do these things? Like, are you kidding me? But he did. He did. I'll leave it at that. How else to say without giving too much away?
If that's how much you're going to give away, we're not giving away anymore on our end. I don't want to be the person who does that. Jill, do you want to ask some of these questions that we got so far from the listeners? There's some really good ones here.
There is. Yeah. One that just came through I like is, so, you know, how did people know she went missing? Like, how did the story get out?
Right. That's a great question. So what's interesting about it is I feel like in some ways it's one of the first, it's definitely not the first, but it's one of those first instances in which the press and the paparazzi to a certain extent really took hold of a story and gave it wings. You know, her disappearance, so this is not giving anything away. She disappeared late in the evening, but people really weren't aware of her disappearance till early in the morning of the 4th. The police in her area got news of it because her car was found running on the edge of really not a cliff per se, but a very steep hill that overlooked a deep, still lake known as the Silent Pond. And there was all sorts of like legends and myths around this place. You know, it was kind of a dark, gloomy place. Her car was actually found running in the early hours of the morning. This is actually, like, you know, a wooded area. That's why her car was found. And her belongings were strewn about the area, and she herself was nowhere to be found. No one knew where she went. Letters notwithstanding, letters left behind notwithstanding. And, you know, the idea of this young, defenseless wife of a World War I hero, mother of a young daughter. Her daughter was about 6 or 7 at the time. I should know that, but it really captured the imagination of the people. It just seems, of the people of England, it seemed so scary and tragic and really struck people. Think if it happened to her, maybe it could happen to us. And people felt tremendous sympathy. And so right from the start, the story picked up among local and then national newspapers, radios. And then the story spread internationally. There was an article in the New York Times about it. The fact that she was also somewhat known, of course, fueled that story. And of course, the fact that she wrote mystery novels and here was a mystery. You know, all of those things kind of played into they were all sparks that gave rise to this huge flame. I mean, this was an enormous news story. It was covered around the clock as they got back then, right? People were staked out at their house. People wanted to participate. Thousands and thousands of volunteers combed the area around her house, around where the car was found. That lake was dredged. And then all these reports started to come in, people claiming that they had sighted her. They'd seen her in a variety, all these sightings. Listen to what's happening to my English. It's just evolving here on the air. All these sightings came in, and people everywhere had claimed that they had seen her on trains in various parts of the country. Abroad, never mind that her passport was found in the car. So, it really captured people's emotions. And then, without giving too much away, information came to light about her husband, which fueled the story even further. And so, this traumatic mystery that was happening to a mystery writer of all people, it was everywhere. And that's how it became known. Actually, I don't know if you guys, I actually should have one right here, but if you open up the hardcover of the book, on the end pages, there are images of the newspaper clippings from the time period. It's like actual newspaper clippings. So you can see some of the headlines, some of the images. One of the newspaper articles is fabulous. It shows, it's an image of her, and it shows what she would look like if she had different disguises on. Right? There were 3 different disguises. Here's what she might look like if you see her on a train and she's
who
woman,
knows?
So it's like the kind of stuff you would expect to find in one of her own books. It just seemed to me and to many others were just ripped from the pages of one of her own novels. And it's just kind of irresistible.
The tiniest of drawbacks, but Jill and I get advanced reader copies, and they're usually like the paperback version, so we don't get the fun.
We got to get you one with like the end pages.
We'll bug Margaret. I think we could probably do that.
I feel like we could make that happen.
Yeah. Somebody asked, and I think it was from an anonymous person, so I apologize if I didn't see the name, but there are many theories of Agatha Christie having a dissociative fugue state. Do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, so there have been many, many theories about what happened to her because the police never really came up with a conclusion. I mean, she resurfaced there and she never commented on it. There was one interview fairly close to the time that she resurfaced that came out in which she very high level talked about it, but that's the only time ever. And as I mentioned, like her autobiography, nothing else talks about it. The fugue state, which is like this disassociate, from what I understand, I'm not an expert in it, but it's like this almost disassociative state where you're kind of not yourself. It's almost like you're operating outside yourself, and then sometimes can think you're someone else entirely. I'm not discounting any of these theories by any stretch. I think we really don't know what happened to her. I think she was in a state of great stress and trauma at the time that she disappeared. But when I look at her, I'm looking at the women I write about. I'm always looking for women who make major contributions, right? And I'm looking for women who are dealing with very modern day issues. When I look at her, obviously her legacy is huge. She ticks the mark on that. I look at a woman who's really struggling. I look at a woman who's struggling between the identity that society has assigned to her and the person that she really believes herself to be. And then there's sort of other traumas going on, which I can't say, right? Kind of all at this time. And when I look at her and I look at what she's just written right before this, and I look at who she ultimately ends up becoming, and I look at how brilliant she is and how her greatest skill is her ability to construct these puzzles that nobody can figure out. To me, it seemed the logical extrapolation from all of that information, the conclusion that I draw. I'm not saying she couldn't have had a fugue state. I'm so sorry about that. I'm not tech savvy and can't stop most of that stuff. She can't, I'm not saying that didn't happen. I'm not saying that it wasn't another there's two or three different possibilities. And in fact, there's a movie, I don't know if you guys have ever watched it, with Vanessa Redgrave as Agatha Christie, Dustin Hoffman as a reporter. I can't remember who plays the husband, in which there's a completely different, very crazy explanation for what happened. I write fiction, so it's what I kind of envision to be the truth. And to me, it's one that's respectful of her talent and respectful of her brilliance and respectful of who she was at that time and then who she became afterwards.
There's a really great comment from someone who is watching right now, and they say they read her autobiography and were surprised to find out she never went to school and was educated by herself and family and friends. Some of them were famous who were in her grandmother's circle of friends.
Yeah. So first of all, kudos to whoever read the autobiography. It's in many ways, it's like a hoot. You know what I mean? It's, you just can't even believe what's in it. But yeah, you're right. In fact, her mother was sort of, she was extremely close to her mother. And in fact, her mother had passed away. It's one of the things that happened within the year prior to her disappearance. So it's really kind of a confluence of all sorts of events happening in her life right at once, right before her disappearance. But her mother actually believed that girls should not be taught to read until they were 5. She didn't believe in school for girls. I mean, her mother was a really bright woman herself. She felt like it rushed the intellect to teach them before they were 5. But Agatha, of course, was extremely bright. And so she literally taught herself to read, and like just came to her mother one day. And despite all her mother's intentions that her daughter not learn how to read before she was 5, she taught herself. And then she had some tutors, which actually was quite common at that time for girls. You know, you have to remember when you think about her education, it was a girl and a young woman's job during that time period in that class to get married. That was really her prime. So all the education and training that she would have had was really to cultivate her into this sort of perfect specimen of womanhood, such that she could get married and then run a home. And again, that's sort of one of those kind of competing things that Agatha was dealing with during this time period. Things were really changing during this time period, or starting to change. And the woman that her mother kind of wanted her to be was different than the woman that she really was. But yeah, her education was pretty much secured of her own volition.
That's really amazing.
That's so amazing.
Isn't it? I mean, when you think about her stories and the plots, but she, you know, I think I mentioned her older sister, Madge. She was quite a bit older than Agatha. Agatha was sort of like the little end child there. And her sister, when she was home, she got married quite young. But even in her earlier, like teen, early 20s years, when she would come home from being out, or before she would go out for the evening, she would lay down with Agatha at bed at night, and they would read mystery novels together. So she kind of steeped her in this language of mysteries from a very young age. And those kind of fascinated Agatha for her own sake, but also as sort of this competitive thing she had with her sister.
I just always keep going back to the fact that like she wrote the first one because basically her sister said she couldn't. That's so fantastic. But
have been done because a family member told you couldn't do that.
That's true.
A lot, probably.
Yeah.
No exception. But yeah, I mean, I think, and in fact, her sister was a writer as well. She had written a series of columns for Vanity Fair, and then she wrote a couple plays. But it was Agatha who was obviously the literary star, and I think that really fueled Agatha for a long time. You know, I mean, they had a very close relationship, and her sister was very supportive, especially during this time period. But you know, it didn't stop her from keeping writing there.
There is another question. Speaking of mysteries, I love this. Was there any idea that it might have been a publicity stunt to get her novels better known?
Well, that's definitely something I've read. That's certainly another, like when I talk about one of those suppositions, I have read that. That is definitely something that some biographers, writers have theorized about. What I can't say, I don't know that for sure. I have kind of my own vision of what happened. That is, you know, fiction, of course. I would say that it didn't hurt her sales, you know, that she disappeared and became kind of a household name. But knowing who Agatha really was and ultimately who she became, I can't imagine that that's the kind of notoriety that she would have wanted for herself. You know, there was a lot of, as you know, if you look at the end papers in the book, you see all these little articles. There's a lot of flattering and not so flattering things out there. It was really, a lot of it was like tabloid fodder. And that's not the kind of thing that really anybody would want written about themselves. Now, perhaps it had one good effect. You know, it certainly let a lot of people know who she was, who might not have been familiar with her books. And she was getting to be successful, but her career did take off after that.
11 days is so long. That's so long to be missing. I always keep thinking about that. I thought about it for so long. It's like,
yeah, as I was writing it, because one of the, as you pointed out, one of the storylines is told from the perspective of her disappearance. It's during those 11 days. I mean, it must have passed at a glacial pace for people, her daughter, obviously, her family, but certainly her husband as well.
Did her husband or daughter ever speak about that time?
No. Her husband, I don't want to say exactly what happened afterwards, but he kind of, I'm sure he was desirous of fading off into the distance after this happened. And he did, you know, I think, you know, he had a business career of his own. Her daughter, I don't believe anybody really ever spoke about it. Certainly not anybody who was friends with her or a family member of her. Everybody knew how she felt about talking about that time period. It's really forbidden.
Somebody asked, and this is interesting. They mentioned that Lisa asked, you said that you write fiction. Do you distinguish like what you write from historical fiction? Because I always just say when we talk to you, it's historical fiction. But do you delineate between the two?
I'm sorry?
Do you kind of like delineate, like, would you say you're a historical fiction writer or a fiction? Again, I always just call you a historical fiction writer.
I would say historical fiction, you know, because so much of what I am, you know, interested in, that the lens through which I kind of look at the world kind of has the lens of the past in it. And when I go into the past and look at these women, I think they're in many ways like a gateway for us to reconsider ourselves. You know, sometimes that distance of the past allows us to see more clearly those issues that are topical and timely to us. Sometimes if things are too close, people get defensive, or their sort of old tapes kind of start churning again. You know, I don't know that I would want to veer from straight up, you know, from historical fiction. I'm so interested in understanding sort of the arc of a woman's life and looking at it through that lens of the past. But I would call myself a historical fiction writer, or fiction, whatever. You can call me whatever. Just read my books. Right?
There you go. That's good. That's good. Well, sort of on that, this is a question from Susie in our audience. If you had to give a percentage of what part of your book is from your research and what part is what you inferred, what would you estimate?
Like we ask this every time. This is like such a big us question.
I know,
for
but
you too.
That is such a hard question. I think it'd be impossible to answer that. Because, you know, sometimes you have more resource material, sometimes you have less. I mean, here, for example, we have a big gaping hole right in the middle of the story that I have filled in. It's probably a lot more fiction. But by the same token, I also know a lot, right? I know, especially about the days of the disappearance, I know what the police were doing on each different day of the disappearance. I know, you know, what kind of reports, sighting reports they were tracking down. I know how many people assembled to comb through the woods around the area where her car was found. Like, I know all that stuff, but do I know the conversation that happened between the police officers and her husband when she was missing? No. So when I'm doing that whole scene, you know, there's a lot of facts kind of woven into the fiction. The best I can describe it is what I've already said, which is it's really like the architecture. It's like the structure upon which the fiction hangs. And if I deviate hugely, I really try to let people know. But I think when you know you're reading historical fiction, and, you know, I know, for example, the date on which Agatha met her husband, Archibald Christie. I know it was a dance. I know it was at a particular hall. I know she found him captivating. I know they danced once or twice. But do I know what actually happened? What they said to each other on the dance floor? No idea. So how do you break down in that context what percentage is fact and what percentage is fiction? Very challenging. Very challenging. I love to have the architecture I love that. But I also love to imagine what they said to each other as they were dancing around, you know?
Well, and I've always loved your books because even, you know, there are parts you're telling a story, you're creating a fiction, but I'm still learning more about the lives of these people. Like Agatha Christie, like I said, like I've known her stories. I didn't really know much about her life other than the fact that she did disappear.
Right.
You know, like the first, you know, the other Einstein, when we wrote about Maleva, like I knew nothing about her. And so I think even, you know, when people say like, oh, I don't want people to ever think like, oh, Marie's just taking realistic things and just having fun with her own story. Like, you're still informing people about these important women who need to have the spotlight.
Well, thank you. I mean, I hope so. You know, I pick them because we are living every day with their legacies. And for the most part, we don't know who they are, right? You know, certainly Agatha Christie, we know her. She's really the exception. You know, we know she's a huge legacy and we know exactly what it is. And she's celebrated for it. And in fact, that fact almost made me not want to write the book. You know, I have a huge list of women I want to write about. I felt like, is it fair really to write about somebody who's so known, who is already celebrated, who was already recognized for what they did, when there's so many other women who haven't been. But when I really looked at her life and I realized, without giving away too much, what the struggle she faced, how timely that is, how modern that is, and then how she had to become an unreliable narrator of her own life in order to move forward. And when I really thought about how often we all do that, we all rewrite our histories, we all rewrite and repackage ourselves to move through the world, I thought her story was in some ways very unusually timely and important in its own way. So I went for it. I did.
No, I think it fits, right? Because your whole thing is about sort of those unknown stories about these women. And, you know, this is like the most unknown story you could probably come up with, because there's so like, there is like these 11 days are just, nobody knows what happened.
Right.
Nobody knows.
And do you see how it's an invitation for me to go in there?
Yes, I do.
Exactly.
A card in the mail.
100%.
Please attend Agatha's 11 missing days and find out what happens. So again, we will probably never know unless there's some hidden manuscript in some long forgotten drawer in which she details exactly what happened. We will likely never know what happened, but gosh, I really hope what I wrote is what happened. I do.
Okay. Wow. Okay, man. Kudos to everyone listening and watching. You guys have really great questions, and then we're not gonna be able to get to all of them, but goodness. Okay. Are you, we always ask this too, and we can find out afterwards, but let's see if everyone else is allowed to find out now. Are you allowed to talk about who you're writing about next?
Yes, I can. Well, actually, I just turned it in, so it's pretty exciting. I think I'm allowed to talk. I'm going to talk about it anyway, because I think it's something else. I don't care. I actually just finished writing a book that's going to come out next year in January about Rosalind Franklin. Now, you may have never heard of her. Ooh, maybe you have. She's definitely somebody who's not known or not well known at all. She was a gifted scientist, British scientist, and then really came of age in like the 1940s and early 50s. And she actually, through she was a physical chemist, and she used this process called X-ray crystallography, which is really taking X-rays of microscopic atomic particles, and then using those images to derive a structure, to understand what the composite parts of that tiny substance really are. And she used this technique over a period of years to come up with the structure of DNA. She's the one who discovered that DNA was a double helix. And you know, that her understanding of what it was comprised of, how it was structured, how it replicated, really is oh gosh, it's really the foundation of modern day genetics and so many other things. She discovered this in a lab in King's College, and unbeknownst to her, her research and her image, this famous image in particular called Photograph 51, were taken by her colleague and shown to two other scientists working at Cambridge. And those three gentlemen won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of DNA, and she did not. And she ultimately, without giving like too much of a spoiler because it's well known, she developed ovarian cancer from the x-rays that she used to make her discovery. So she actually sacrificed herself for this world-changing discovery and didn't get any credit. Oh. Sorry.
It's kind of people watching this will see Jill and I like at the same time have the same reaction. Like the light bulb went off. We're both like, oh, I know who those men are. Oh yeah. No. Oh.
Watson, Crick, and Wilson. Yeah, I mean, look, they're famous. I mean, those three are famous. It's really it's an amazing story of like a strong, tenacious, flawed woman who is determined to really make these discoveries and would really stop at nothing. But it also is really a look at this very I don't want to call it flawed as well, but it was at that time a very flawed scientific system that allowed for this marginalization of her contributions to happen, both at the time and in the years to follow. And what's interesting about it, and it's not something I can write in the book, but I'm going to write like a really long author's note, I think, for it. You know, when you think about your sources, there really isn't a lot about that Rosalind left behind. There's some family letters, which they don't really share, but really were formed the basis of this one particular biography. The reason that Rosalind Franklin is known at all is because James Watson, who was one of the men who won the Nobel Prize, wrote a biography about the discovery, and he painted her in the most appalling light. And that book gave rise to another biography by a woman named Anne Sayers, who was a friend of Rosalind. So in many ways, her book is kind of like a biography and kind of like, it's almost like original source material because she's recounting stuff from letters and conversations that rose up in response to this depiction that Watson made. And then two other biographies came out. So you have these competing biographies of a woman, all of which tell us so much about the men who used her information, their guilt, the scientific system that they lived in at the time. And in their defensiveness, they're telling us so much about their guilt and what they actually did. So it's actually fascinating. The more I did the research, the more I almost want to invite people to read some excerpts from these biographies just to see what they're dealing with. And it really reflects what Rosalind was dealing with. Mm-hmm. And so many women today still deal with. So I can't get away from the science, right? I'm always, even though I'm not a scientist, I'm always back with the science. I don't know.
Well, no, I think that makes sense. I think, that is one, we talk even now, like women in STEM are at a disadvantage and not represented. So I feel like there's probably a lot of stories that you can find in the sciences.
So many. And so what's interesting is, when I could give talks in the world at large, I would often, especially when I was talking about The Only Woman in the Room or The Other Einstein, which really have a science focus, so many women came up and shared their own personal stories with me. And, it was sort of in those conversations that I really understood how historical fiction really allows us to recognize things about our society and ourselves, which would have been very hard. Like some of these women told me that if they had read a memoir about a modern day scientist, it wouldn't have hit them in the same way that something that has that perspective of time and when things are really thrown into bold relief. So this is about as bold relief as you can get. It's crazy. So but she was an amazing woman. She really was.
So we're almost out of time, but before we go, can you tell everyone when they can get the Mystery of Mrs Christie and where they can get it and all of that good stuff so they know? Because the book isn't out yet, but we want to do this on 12/3 because of the special date. So can you give everyone all that good detail?
You guys are the best. First of all, I just want to say thank you for being fabulous duo that you are, and having me back every year for our annual event.
We love you.
Yes, we
and
do.
I'll be back. If you have me, I'll be back, and hopefully it'll be in person by this time next year. Oh my gosh, I hope. Crossed. Even if we're socially distanced in person across a field.
Yeah, across a field.
So the Mystery of Mrs. Christie is available on December 29th, Tuesday, in any possible fashion you can think about. You can order it at your indie bookstore, you can listen to it, you can e-read it anywhere. You can get it at Barnes & Noble, any bookstore, anywhere, and any format you can think about. So I hope that that people enjoy it, that it kind of gives them a fresh look at Agatha Christie and her books, and that you can kind of see her in there. And also a fresh look at what women were dealing with during the time period that she wrote these books. And if they pre-order, I do want to say this because I think it's so cool. My publisher is doing a giveaway for people who pre-order and submit it. They specially made a lipstick for the launch.
That's fun.
It is a lipstick which you've seen the cover. She's wearing like a very 1920s red lipstick, and guess what they named it? Red Herring.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Oh, good.
Great. I love it. So not to push the pre-orders or anything, but this is probably a limited Red Herring opportunity.
Okay, so we are going to leave everyone by watching the trailer. I hope I'm not going to mess this up, Sydney. Thank you for reminding me. So we're going to play this trailer. It's about 90 seconds or so, and then everything's going to kind of end. So first off, Marie, thank you very much. You're our favorite. And now I'm going to try and share my screen.
Okay.
And hopefully not mess this up.
I'm terrible at screen sharing, obviously.
Well, we'll see. All right, so I think I've got it, and here we go.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys. Thank you so much.